Physical media is fun, isn't it? Isn't it great to just preserve time right then and there? There's no context of the future or updates that have happened. And that's why lately I've really been into collecting copies of these. Old issues of Alternative Press. Now, Alternative Press, kind of a mainstream mag, I guess you could say, for punk and DIY culture. It's very much the hot topic of music magazines. It's hardly like a zine or anything like that. But it is an interesting way to chronicle what was going on in popular punk, especially back in the early to mid 2000s.
That's what I do!
Now, today we're going to break down a cover story from an issue that was on the shelves till about February of 2003. The issue is officially the February 03 edition. However, as you know how magazines work, they're kind of there for a long while before the month actually happens. And I have another video shot that you may see in the future, which actually goes through the previous month's AP, kind of line by line. That's not what this is. That may be released someday. But for now, I just wanted to get into the cover story here. Because who is on the cover? Well, it's Brody and the Distillers. Now, why is that particularly interesting? Well, if you know anything about the trajectory of the Distillers, I think you'll know exactly what I'm talking about here. And this article comes out in a very interesting time. This is post the Distillers' release of Sing Sing Death House. This is post everyone knowing about Tim and Brody as an item. And it's pre that Rolling Stones cover. So I thought this would be an interesting time capsule to check out. Now, before we get too deep into it, I kind of want to note some of my biases going into this. Like, I remember reading this as a kid, but I don't remember a lot of nuance from this article. However, as anyone that knows me can attest to, I am a huge fan of the band Rancid. I love their music. To me, they are the best band of all time, punk or otherwise. The best songwriters of all time as a collection and a band, Rancid. The best punk album of all time, and Out Come the Wolves. So those are my clear biases. And I'll be honest with you, when Tim and Brody split, I was definitely Team Tim. And I kind of look back at that and it's a little funky. Like, why should I care about two people I don't know and their divorce? But dang, I took it personally, and some people really took this a little too far. Some people got a little tribal with it. I'll try to stay away from that now and more of the nuance of those stories. But I do think it's interesting to examine what the attitudes and feelings were like, especially in this period, because we don't think about this period as much. So let's dive into the article. Now, our title here is Never Say Die, and we have Brody getting other members of the band in a headlock. Kind of cool. Oh, and another thing, I'll just get out of the way here. Back in this era, I had the biggest crush ever on Brody. Like, I was totally into her. And it makes sense, right? She was like the one punk rock female in like somewhat mainstream culture that you believed was actually punk and not playing it as a role. Well, at least some people thought that. Having braved personal travails, a revolving door lineup, and constant inspection by the punk police, the Distillers are looking forward with mixed emotions on the amount of ass that needs to be kicked in the near future. This story is by Tom Lanham, photos by philmucci.com. All right, the stage is set. Let's really dive into the article. Let's check out this lead, and I think this is going to be interesting. The backwoods revenuers weren't there to rain on the Distillers' parade, but the evening appeared as if it were about to turn nasty. Hatfield's and McCoy's nasty. Real get you shooting iron ma nasty. Interesting. So the article opens with an anecdote about the Distillers opening up for No Doubt. Pretty natural fit, you could see, for a lot of reasons, although the article's not framing it as that. It's framing the Distillers as like the rotten stepchild of this tour that also featured Garbage. So a very female-fronted tour. And it makes the contrast for the fans that were there to see No Doubt and Garbage versus the fans that were there to see the Distillers. Look at this line it gives from one of the Pinky chicks, as they refer to her. Like, oh my God, they like totally suck. Let's go back to No Doubt merchandise. And apparently no fights broke out. That's good to hear. Let's read this paragraph starter about the scene at the time. The pink world may soon be splashed with punky cherried red as Armstrong's trademark lipstick. With new metal slipping into the tar pit and a Hives, Vines, Strokes, new rock revival in full bloom, major labels are suddenly expanding their definition of what constitutes good. Read marketable rock and roll. It notes here how many major labels have already showed interest in the Distillers, who put out their last album on Hellcat, an imprint of Epitaph. And Hellcat, of course, is run by Tim Armstrong, who just also happens to be, at this time, Brody's husband. Okay, we get an interesting little anecdote about the effect that Red Bulls could have on Brody and her possible acquisition of male genitalia in the process. However, the writer goes on to note that she may have already acquired some metaphorical male genitalia. Metaphorically, at least, she's already packing quite a pair. From her early street urchin days in far-off Melbourne, Australia, to the one lady who never took any guff from the male-dominated music industry. From snooty top execs all the way to the lowest nightclub owner, bouncer. Something like that. I kind of screwed that up. That's not part part of the quote. Many of whom will recall her from her first imprint on their jaw. And she doesn't need her old man to back her up. It goes on to talk about her pretty well-known background. If you want to know more about it, check out Dan Ozzi's book, Sellout. That has a really good Distillers section, and probably the most words that have ever been strictly dedicated to the Distillers. And it notes how her and Tim met, both in this article and in the book, and as is always needing to be mentioned, she was literally 17 when they met. Brody gives some background on herself, and noting that she is generally motivated by fear. And she takes some shot at the plastic surgery industry. I'm not saying this is being disingenuous, but a lot of this is that kind of myth making that you would do. And it's what happens to every artist that's on the cover of AP. It's less critical, and I'm not necessarily being critical of AP for being like this, but they are making the myth of who Brody is, or at least was. Oh, and there's actually a little insert here from Shirley Manson of Garbage. She says, "If I were a betting woman, I'd be putting my money on Brody Armstrong to spearhead the movement of a whole new generation of fiercely talented, independent, and articulate women on the music scene, out of the shadows and into mainstream consciousness. There hasn't been a female rock singer of her caliber in a very long time. Not only is she in possession of an extraordinary, emotive, and powerful voice, but at only 23 years old, with 2 albums under her belt and another one on the way, she's a blossoming songwriter and extremely accomplished guitarist. The fact that she also happens to be a soulful, whip-smart, and charismatic doesn't hurt her too much either. All hail Brody Armstrong, I say, for she will deliver us from the hands of those vacuous corporate whores who have been faking it on our airwaves for far too long." I'm assuming she's talking about like the Avril Britney Spears wing of popular music at this point, which this is still like the diva era of VH1 and the Teen Queens and all that. Brody could have been that. Brody really could have been that. It's really unfortunate that circumstances that really had nothing to do with her star power or her songwriting prevented that from happening. The article does go on here, though. Interesting there that Brody notes that she has a lot of even young female fans at the time that come up and tell her how beautiful she is, but she rarely gets compliments on playing her guitar. Brody goes on to note that really Gwen Stefani is the only female from their sort of neck of the woods that is making it big at the time. There are no more Courtney Loves or Al Sevens in the mainstream. Although Courtney Love was still around at this point, but she's more of a celebrity than really having anything to do with Hole. Brody notes how the recent political climate, one with George W. Bush as president and the assault at that time on women's rights, is something they need to take note of, and that she was going to start a revolution. No, that was not a statement from last year. That was a statement from 20 years ago. Outbreak, one of the other members of the band, notes that young men are just being fed aesthetics right now and not music. I don't think that was necessarily unique to the early 2000s. People at that time, though, just would not give pop artists credit as musicians. I feel like the climate's changed, maybe because the indie boom kind of gives this weird credibility to people, although I don't think it should, but they're taken more seriously as musicians with like this indie background. That means the mainstream doesn't operate that much different than punk rock, actually. Outbreak also notes how the punk purists have been on them, especially at this point with their flirtations, and I think they were signed at this point to the major label. I'd have to go back and double check that. But as Brody returns to the interview, she does ponder the fact that her label could make her shed her clothes. Yeah, they were signed. At this point, though, it's Hellcat and Sire. So Sire, a label, and it notes this earlier in the article, I should have picked up on that, a label that has punk rock credibility and history. But as we know, when the album came out, Hellcat was no part of it. Even at this point, Brody is done with the musical elite, as she refers to them. Let's put it here. Music elite, those factions in punk rock that won't let anyone out of the gate. And it's like you're in the jailhouse and you're not allowed to go out and see what the rest of the world is like, she says. And the more they do that, the more it makes me want to sell more and more records. Because the Distillers have a good message, you know? A message that actually fights against everything bad that we've been talking about lately. And the article wraps up kind of talking about how maybe this major label section will be a gateway for people to get into punk rock. This article made me sad in a lot of ways, going back and revisiting it. Sad for a few reasons. One, that the Distillers didn't become what they could have. And that makes me sad, not because they didn't make it. Plenty of bands never make it. But they didn't make it for reasons that have nothing to do with their music. If you remember the time period, really, that was just a couple months after this article when that Rolling Stone cover dropped and we realized that the Distillers and Brody were not going to be part of punk rock at all anymore. But why is that? Well, it's because of the divorce. Now, I'm not a big fan of the way the Rancid camp handled this. Like, I'm not going to stop listening to Rancid. I'm not on that level with it. But clearly, this was not handled well by them. And by extension, it wasn't handled well by punk rock fans. Myself included. Now, I'm not doing this to be some, like, confession of how I behaved, but I was a subscriber to Rolling Stone magazine back in the day. I saw those photos and I was like, screw them. And then on top of that, Rancid releases an album that basically the theme of it is this guy is sad because he got divorced. Now, nothing wrong with that. Albums about relationships and breaking up, they're common in all genres of music, especially punk rock. However, and I think this is interesting because this is before the days of mass social media, there was this need to take a side. And I think this still happens with celebrity culture, but as someone who's quite a bit older now, I don't really have to get involved with it. In all actuality, divorces are a personal thing between two private parties. However, when it comes to celebrities, we tend to take sides. And if you're more inclined to just like the punk rock side of things, of course you were going to take the Rancid side. And that's not to say Brody and the Distillers were perfect in everything they said and did. I'm not saying that at all. But what I'm saying is it became this binary choice. Because think about what the Distillers had working against them. They were now on a major label. There was now a divorce from one of the most credible and beloved members of the punk rock scene, especially at the time when he really was like the godfather. Oh, and this is very superficial, but it's an association with Queens of the Stone Age. I freaking hate that band. And I think a lot of people had that same thought. Like that was the strain of mainstream music that like I personally didn't like. Like I'm okay with the pop punk stuff. The pop punk boy band into punk rock thing, fine with that. Whatever the hell Queens of the Stone Age is, get that shit out of here. That stuff was awful. And then there's probably a little bit of misogyny to go along with it as well. It's also the statements that were made by many celebrities also. At this point, Tim Armstrong was pretty well beloved, and this really started the era of Tim Armstrong being such a featured songwriter on artists even outside of punk. So he was the one with like the friends, and Brody really wasn't. And I think the Distillers learned a very hard and unfortunate lesson about making it big in punk rock. Like if you make it big, you have to make it huge. You have to basically replenish an entire fan base like 3x. Think about what a band like Green Day had to go through, where they were completely forsaken by their punk scene. But it kind of didn't matter. Dookie became one of the biggest albums of all time. And even if their follow-up albums before American Idiot weren't as big, they were still major successes. Coral Fang is a big album, and by all accounts, a massive success. But not big enough where it changed mainstream music in the same way like Dookie did. So they lost all that punk rock credibility in the process and kind of had nothing left at the end. It's good to see, though, that the Distillers still perform and Brody still gets out there. They sound amazing if you check out any of the clips online. The songs from Coral Fang, too. I didn't really care for the album at the time because I think I was kind of had those Rancid blinders on. And now I just don't care about any of that. I don't actually know any of these people, so what do I care? The album's very good. I don't care who released it. It's a really good punk rock album. And it's a real shame that the success and the isolation kind of ended the Distillers prematurely. Yes, they're still around, but ended that initial run. Because who knows where they could have been. I mean, look at who got famous in the ensuing years. You mean to tell me that Brody couldn't have been on the forefront of all of that? I guess in the end, though, that's what made her and the Distillers so punk rock. Hope you enjoyed this trip down memory lane. I intend to do more features like this in the future. So if you have any specific pieces of physical media like this and articles that you want me to review, go ahead and let me know in the comment section. But speaking of Rancid, if you want to see my ranking of most of their albums, go ahead and click on this video right here. Talk to you next time.